Thank you so much, April. So let's get started. We have a lot of slides hanging moving forward, and this is what we're going to cover in today's webinar. First, I'm going to look at why are so many people talking about per-and polyfluoroalkyl substances, and I'll give about 12 reasons for concern. Because that's quite a dense presentation, we'll have a brief Q&A for about 5 minutes, and then we'll resume looking at the public access to information about PFAS, the Canadian government response, and then Brenaine will take over and talk about the case study in North Bay, Ontario. We'll finally finish with just some recognition of the market shift to PFAS-free, and then we'll open it for a Q&A and discussion with all of you on the webinar. Here are 2 new resources posted on the CELA website, links at the bottom, the fact sheet on the left, which some of you may hopefully have seen, but more importantly, or just as importantly, the very in-depth report with this very long title that looked at the use of PFAS in paper and textiles. All the references and content that I'm going to be briefly touching on in the webinar is all in this report. And another website I wanted to alert you to is this wonderful PFAS Central website. It was put up by Arlene Bloom and her team at the Green Science Policy Institute in Berkeley. If you really want to keep up to date on all the new science and the policy moves and what's happening with lawsuits and different drinking water standards, et cetera, just keep visiting this website. It really is a very good compilation of data. So let's kick into the wonderful world of PFAS, and why are so many people talking about this big class of chemicals. PFAS for short is for per-and polyfluoroalkyl substances. They've been around a long time. They first began production in the 1940s, and of course they were found to be very useful for stain resistance, water repellency, coatings, firefighting foam, etc. Last count by the OECD is the class comprises over 4,700 different fluorinated chemicals that are both long chain and short chain. And it's important to know that there's probably more than this, because many chemicals are on the market which actually have never been identified. So we are constantly coming across new forms and breakdown products of this class of chemicals. The original manufacturers, 3M, of course, made Scotchgard, which many of us or parents or whatever used to spray on our sofas and used in rugs for stain repellency. And of course, Teflon, widely produced the polyfluoro substance used in non-stick pans. DuPont then spun off much of its fluorine production to a company called Chemours in 2015. The history of PFAS and PFOA goes back to the 1900s, and certainly the toxicity data started coming through in the 1960s and 70s. But PFAS were generally not a big issue in environmental discussions because of the lack of analytical detection equipment. In 2000 and 2006, you saw moves to voluntarily withdraw these long-chain PFOA and PFAS from the market. And like DuPont, 3M, and the other manufacturers in the States and even Canada, started moving to the new shorter chain fluorinated varieties, but underscored that none of these have been proven safe. 2 movies I wanted to alert you to. Netflix, of course, if you want to look at the history of what went down in West Virginia with the DuPont emissions, check that one out. And then coming next month is a new movie coming with our Mark Ruffalo playing the lawyer Rob Bilott, who took the class action suit against DuPont, and the story of how that all happened. So let's start with reasons for concern. Number 1, of course, is that PFAS is found in many common products. Again, stain repellency. It's also used in food packaging to avoid grease and and oils. It's also used in inks, in food packaging, widely used in cosmetics, in clothing for your outdoor gear, and adhesives and sealants and paints, and of course the Teflon nonstick cookware, and particularly firefighting foam for Class B fires. So they're used ubiquitously. Number two, they're called the forever chemicals. This is a term that is used to describe this class of PFAS because, of course, they're not found in nature, and the strength of the carbon-fluorine molecular bond brings this extreme stability and persistence in the environment. Some of them may degrade, but what we're seeing is that they degrade into PFAS or PFOA, and note that all PFAS will eventually transform into these highly stable end products. The scary bit is that, of course, they remain in the environment for hundreds or even thousands of years. So we are leaving a legacy of these chemicals for future generations. And again, the OECD count of 4,700 currently note that only a few have been regulated. Most have not been monitored. All are very mobile in water and soil. Just this year, the US EPA Action Plan on PFAS summarized the overarching challenges for the management of this class by saying that health and occurrence data and analytical methods are available for certain PFAS, such as the PFOAs and PFAS. However, for most chemicals in this class, there is limited or no toxicity information. And recent monitoring studies confirm that humans in the environment are being exposed to a wide range of organofluorine compounds with increasing ratios of unidentified ones. Keep that in mind, unidentified. Number three, yep, the Great Lakes are contaminated with PFAS. The Identification Task Team, which is a committee created under the Great Lakes Water Quality Agreement in 2015, declared these long chain particular PFAS chemicals of mutual concern in the Great Lakes Basin. The majority, again, have not been monitored or assessed, and levels are generally found higher in areas of Lake Ontario, the western end of Lake Erie, and the Detroit River corridors. And as we know, the Great Lakes Basin contains 20% of the world's fresh surface water. These are just two examples of what came through in a 2009 report showing, again, the prevalence. This is for PFAS in the Great Lakes tributaries. You can see the elevated levels around urban centers, such as Toronto, Hamilton Harbor, Bay of Quinte, areas of Lake Ontario, and near the St. Clair, Southern Lake Huron area. This one on the left, I'm intrigued by because it looks at the perfluorinated carboxylic acids, which is a form of the perfluoroalkyls, very persistent, highly fluorinated, and you'll notice the levels are the highest in the Toronto region. So where are all these air emissions coming from and water emissions coming from? Well, we're all exposed via food, water, and house dust. And this is according to Health Canada's report that for adults, our main routes of exposure is by the ingestion of food, drinking water, and house dust that contains these chemicals, unless, of course, you're a worker in a plant that is giving you higher exposure using PFAS chemicals. For infants, toddlers, and children, as with many other persistent compounds, it is the oral hand-to-mouth contact with these same consumer products, particularly carpets, clothing, and upholstery. Fifth reason for concern is that it is a global contaminant. We know we have levels and up in the Canadian Arctic. They are global contaminants, and of course this started the Stockholm Convention for POPs listing first PFAS, PFOS, for concern in 2009, and subsequently have been adding PFOA and other PFAS chemicals for restriction and analysis. Another reason for concern is that we all here contain PFAS chemicals. Biomonitoring, Health Canada biomonitoring results back in 2002 found that for PFAS and PFOA, all Canadian population sampled did contain these chemicals. Keep in mind, we don't know how contaminated we are with other forms of PFAS. And in some cases for PFAS and PFOA, You're seeing human samples may be declining a bit, but generally they're remaining stable. And of course, the fact that industry has moved to short chain PFAS means we're seeing more more exposure to short chain. Where is all this happening and why are we constantly exposed is because PFAS, being highly persistent, they're found in legacy waste sites. And of course, we are constantly exposed from consumer goods, drinking water, and food that contain these chemicals. So what about the health impacts? The US Federal Agency for Toxic Substances and Disease Registry noted here, as you can see in the bullet points, increased cholesterol levels associated with the long chain, the ones they studied. Very interestingly or worryingly, there's a decrease in how the body responds to vaccines, and we're seeing this happen at levels that are lower than what we generally contain for PFAS, PFOA, and other long chain. There's an increased risk of thyroid disease, decreased risk of fertility in women, and because these chemicals love to reside in protein-rich organs such as the blood and liver, you're seeing a different impact to the usual POPs, persistent organic pollutants that like to reside in fat. So we're seeing a lot of increase in testicular cancer, kidney cancer, etc. And I put at the top of the slide what we know so far because data is coming in almost every week. Reason for concern number 8 is firefighting foam is a major cause of drinking water and groundwater contamination with PFAS. Started using PFAS in what's called aqueous film forming foam in the 1960s because it did such a good job at smothering fires for Class B oil and fuel-based fires. It's important to note that we don't know to what extent this use of firefighting foam has contaminated Canadian wells, drinking water, and groundwater, but usually the contamination is near military bases and airports. And of course, we don't seem to be testing for PFAS. I found this recently, Hamilton, 8 years ago, someone actually started, it wasn't from the airport or from the government, it was a volunteer working for a local NGO in Hamilton, discovered very high levels of PFAS downstream of the Hamilton International Airport. And 8 years later, there's still an issue about who is cleaning up and who is paying for it. The issue here is that treating water contaminated with PFAS is incredibly difficult and costly. Granulated activated carbon can remove some PFAS, particularly the long chain, but for shorter chain, it's not very effective, which is why many regulators are now using reverse osmosis to try to deal with the removal of these shorter chain PFAS. Reason for concern number 9 is that, well, we finally got federal drinking water guidelines issued a few months ago, and I put this chart up just to show the fact that I do not consider this at all precautionary. The Health Canada drinking water maximum acceptable concentration up here is 0.200 micrograms per liter for PFOA and PFOS 0.600. If you scroll down, you'll see that Ontario, Quebec has no drinking water standards. BC is the only province that's issued them. But check this out in comparison to even the US Environmental Protection Agency Lifetime Health Advisory, which is almost 10 times lower at 0.07. And you'll notice some of the states have gone even lower than that to 7 to 11 times lower than the US Environmental Protection Agency. So there's a lot of work and questions to be asked around how we came to these levels. Communities lack information on levels of PFAS in their drinking water, groundwater, and well water. I did what was available publicly and noticed that there was a lot of monitoring, but it was always, 21 wastewater treatment plants across Canada or certain streams here and there. Nothing was site specific. So is this happening? We don't know. Is there a requirement for municipalities to monitor and make the data publicly available? Number 10 reason for concern is wastewater treatment plants do not remove PFAS. This is a shot of Ashbridges Bay wastewater treatment plant, one of Canada's oldest and biggest, serving 1.5 million people. The standard water treatment technologies, which are great at getting rid of many bacteria, such as coagulation and separation and UV irradiation and disinfection, really have little or no effect on PFAS or PFOA concentrations. This is a report done by Health Canada in 2016. And they may even create more PFAS. Fascinating. In fact, these wastewater treatment plants are almost like biological concentrators. Data shows that the levels of PFAS leaving wastewater treatment plants are actually higher than the amount of PFAS coming in to the wastewater treatment plants, both for air and effluent. Last two reasons for concern is PFAS and sewage sludge and paper mill sludge can contaminate the food chain. So we have been using sewage sludge for many years, spreading it on land or for landscaping or for forestry. If that sludge contains PFAS, which it likely does, we're now seeing uptake, particularly of short chain PFAS into the food chain. And we have 61 pulp and paper mills in the Great Lakes St. Lawrence River ecosystem. Many of these may or probably were using PFAS to coat paper, but we have no, I could not find any measurements of the amount of PFAS leaving the paper mills or spreading of paper mill sludge. This is important because now we're finding that sludge is causing contamination to farmers. Here's a Maine farmer, Fred Stone, who had to dump all his milk, his dairy, because of the use of paper mill sludge back in the 1980s. And then finally, toxics in, toxics out. We are now creating an ongoing PFAS toxic waste problem. Measurements over landfills show that the deposition of carpets, textiles, paper, and other waste is now generating releases of these chemicals to the environment. And in fact, leachate is a very significant source of PFAS chemicals to air, water, and land. Keep in mind that if you run leachate through wastewater treatment plants, you're probably creating more PFAS. And again, I could not find any regulations on PFAS testing in leachate. So I've been given the 0 minute from Faye here. We thought we'd open it up for 5-minute pause for Q&A before we carry on. I think it's over to you, April, right?
Sure, thank you, Bev. We have one question in the Q&A box, John, that I'll read out, and you can perhaps suggest who you think would be best to answer it. The question we have is, if more PFAS are coming out of water treatment plants than is going in, where is it coming from? Please clarify.
I think this is clearly for Bev. It doesn't need to go through me. Bev?
What's happening, it appears from the studies that Environment Canada did, but also this is a big issue of research across the world, is the precursors of many forms of PFAS do break down, and they break off and they form longer chain of, for instance, of PFOS and PFOA. So you can get different types of PFAS that are entering and breaking and generating even more types of PFAS. The molecular chains start degrading and transforming into other molecular structures. It's a big source of research right now into the mechanisms of how that is actually happening. But every time you measure effluent coming out, this isn't just in Canada, you find that there's more PFAS being generated through the process going on in the wastewater treatment plant.
Okay, a couple more questions have come in while you were answering that one. So the next question is, any data on contamination of the Hudson Bay Basin?
Ooh, I don't know. That would be interesting to look at. I know that the Northern Contaminants Department has been measuring up in the Arctic and here in Burlington at the Center for Inland Waters, of Health Canada's, Environment Canada's scientists has been spending a lot of time in the Arctic. This I don't know. We would have to see what is available online.
Okay, thank you. And another question, there was a quick reference to vaccination, but the point was missed. Can you repeat that, please?
Sure. What we're seeing is that PFAS somehow is preventing the uptake of vaccines or the impact of vaccines in the human body. Um, there is studies have shown that children that were vaccinated are coming down with the diseases that they were vaccinated for. And when they measure the levels of PFAS in their serum, they're seeing that even at very small levels, such as 1 nanogram per liter, you're seeing they're associating this with the levels of PFAS in the system. How that is, why that is happening, I don't know. But there's a lot of papers coming through on the impact it's having on the effectiveness of vaccines.
Okay, thank you, Bev. So that's all we have in the Q&A box. Do you want to roll into the next presenter, or do you want folks to have the opportunity to unmute and ask questions?
No, I think we'll roll in because Brene has 5 minutes, but she has a lot of slides, so I think we may just carry on. This is the thing that I'm always intrigued by. When I started writing this report for CELA on the whole issue of PFAS in Canada, the Great Lakes Basin, it took me to a lot of websites around on the U.S. side of the Great Lakes Basin and Michigan, Minnesota, etc. But also, I'm part of a big U.S. network of PFAS, and it's interesting that many U.S. state websites really do actively disseminate information about what's going on in the state, on their monitoring, on their emissions, on where the contamination site locations are. Even the Department of Defense and the Department of Navy in the U.S. has a whole PFAS website, which is very different to the way that we talk about the issue in Canada. And this is just a screenshot of the Michigan site-specific and detailed information that shows you the facility, what was causing the PFAS. In this case, it was a chrome plating facility. PFAS is also used in fume suppressants, mist suppressants in the chrome plating process. This was causing the emissions, the releases of PFAS to the sanitary sewer system. And then they talk about the sampling results and what they're doing with the sludge, what water sample supplies have been impacted, and upcoming community engagement. You know, they'll give you the information on if anything is being scheduled. So the point I'm making here is that there's a lot of much more, I would say, openness to talk about PFAS in the US, in my experience. This is from the Environmental Working Group. They did this great public right to know mapping of contamination sites in the US. Do have a click onto their website because they also translate that into using the US EPA's lifetime health advisory, how many people therefore are exposed to water contaminated with PFAS. This is just a screenshot of the map. You can see the clusters of monitoring data. Again, a lot around the Great Lakes Basin, but note that we have nothing like this at all in Canada to show what is available or where the contamination is. So 2 slides just on the Canadian political response. I titled this slide, "There's a misperception that the problem has been dealt with." Sometimes when I talk about PFAS, people look at me and say, "Oh no, that's been regulated." Maybe because they think I'm saying PFAS, but regardless, we did declare them under the prohibition of certain toxic substances. Both PFAS, PFOA, and other long chains are listed for restriction, but it's important to realize this really is only a handful of the more than 4,700 PFAS in commerce. Health Canada has said both for PFAS, PFOA, it's not a concern for human health, but the whole issue about the mixtures that we're exposed to and how much did we prioritize the limits or levels considered to be, I put in brackets, safe for infant and childhood and vulnerable populations. So I think there's a lot of pushback there. SEPA, as we all know on this call, addresses chemicals one by one, which is totally inadequate for this class, and which is why you're seeing this move in a lot of policy to address PFAS as the entire class for regulation. I'll talk a bit more about that later. And then finally, Again, Health Canada drinking water guidelines are far from precautionary. We still don't have provincial drinking water regulations in the Great Lakes, in Ontario, Quebec. As we said, BC is the only one that's come forth. We don't have PFAS regulations concerning limits for wastewater treatment plants in our sludge, landfill, leachate, paper mills, textile manufacturing, etc. And I think what I haven't seen might be going on in the backgrounds is that we don't seem to be really focusing on the product focus to pressure companies for transparently safer PFAS-free products in food packaging, in textiles. We talk about restrictions in the regulations, but I know the government's having discussions with companies and looking at how quickly they can move off the long chain, but unless we're really pressuring them for PFAS-free, we're going to see a lot of regrettable substitution come in with they're simply moving to short chain. And in fact, this is indeed what's happening. And again, I find in comparison to other countries, we have little transparency on the monitoring data, where the contamination sites are, and again, no occupational health limits for workers in manufacturing plants using these chemicals. So that's a lot of data, and we'll all get the slides. We can talk about it more, but I wanted to switch over to Bernane. I'll move your slides, Bernane, so off you go, and I'll advance them when you say go for it. Bernane?
All right, now, thank you. I was muted just temporarily. So thanks very much, Bev. My name is Bernane Lloyd, and I work with Northwatch, which is a coalition in Northeastern Ontario. But I'm actually presenting today as a North Bay resident, and Northwatch's work is really just very preliminary on this issue. Next slide, please, Bev. So the issue in North Bay really has been building over about a half a century. From the 1950s until the 1980s, there was a very active Canadian Forces base here in North Bay. It was a major employer. It had a fighter jet squadron, and it also had a very active firefighting training. And that firefighting training is thought to be the largest and most significant source of the PFAS in the North Bay systems. So DND, Department of National Defense, has identified 7 locations. I don't know if that's a complete identification or not, and PFAS was present in those locations and has made its way into the local environment. The contaminated sites have impacted groundwater, surface water, private water supplies, and that surface water includes the city's drinking water. Next slide, please. So where we're at right now is Department of National Defense in the last few years has done some monitoring studies. Of the 44 monitoring locations they're using, 39 of them have tested for PFAS, showing presence of PFAS. And that PFAS contamination, according to the DND reports, has entered Lees Creek, which then enters into Delaney Bay in Trout Lake. And that empties out approximately 700 meters away from the water intake pipe for the city of North Bay. So there's 50,000 people draw water from the city's municipal source. There's also private homes take water directly from Trout Lake. So there's an additional impact there. So the map you see now on the screen, the area in the orange quadrangle is the airport, which is a joint civil and military airport, and the Air Force Base, and most of the contamination sources are within that square. Then the yellow is Lees Creek down into the Delaney Bay of Trout Lake. What's not really being addressed in the reports I've seen so far from DND that DND has released, not yet publicly, but has made available to some, is that there was also firefighting foam deposited in the Marsh Drive landfill, which you can see Lake Nipissing on the left-hand side of your screen. The Marsh Drive landfill goes through, enters Sheeny, the leachate enters Sheeny Creek, and into Lake Nipissing. Next slide, please. So the PFAS contamination in Trout Lake is most concentrated in Delaney Bay, where Lees Creek enters, but it is having an impact in farther reaches of the lake as well. And the arrow that you see on the bottom is pointing, connecting the location of the sewage treatment, the water treatment plant with the water treatment plant on the Trout Lake shoreline. Next slide, please. So the agencies have known of this issue for some time. We've learned that D&D has historical data, they call it back to the 1990s. The Ministry of the Environment began sampling specifically for PFAS in Lees Creek and Trout Lake in 2013 and have continued to do some additional sampling. It wasn't until 2017 that this became public information, public knowledge. And D&D has produced some additional reports in 2017 and 2018 as part of their follow-up to that public disclosure. Next slide, please. So since 2017, you can see there's been some public reporting and some public information made available, but still on a very limited basis. Next slide, please. And so the first reports back in 2017 showed that the test results were showing PFAS in Lees Creek. Next slide, please. And in July, the news reports were 2 residences near Air Force Base have unsafe drinking water. Next slide, please. And then the connection was made to the city's drinking water source and how the intake protection zone might need to be broader, expanded. This goes because Trout Creek, Lees Creek does deliver directly into Delaney Bay. Next slide, please. But by July 2018, the story was being told differently. So instead of 2 residences identified as being contaminated, it was only 2 of 91 homes tested. And as the media reported it, D&D has debunked fears that its use of PFAS has caused widespread pollution. Next story, please. Next slide, please. And the health unit and the city have both had some involvement, some engagement, but not really any interaction with the public other than a page on their website, a very preliminary report released, a number you can call, but nothing really that from the public perspective appears to be a very active, engaged, or protective role. Next slide, please. So where the public can look for their information is at the signage posted at Lees Creek, which says, do not eat fish from Lees Creek. So there's a 0 fish consumption in Lees Creek and a restricted fish consumption on Trout Lake. And next slide, please. And Department of National Defense has an action plan, which to date has included do some additional monitoring. No, not even a hint of any intention to actually remediate the sites. Next slide, please. So the status as of 2018, the last report we saw was that D&D had not committed to including any of the properties that they had previously owned and are now contaminated, but which the city took over ownership of some years ago. D&D is not committed to remediation in any of the sites. Some of the homes with high PFAS levels in their wells have been connected to municipal water systems, but at least 1 residence, and that's actually a farm, is not connected. And there have been no public meetings, no public repository of information about PFAS contamination in North Bay. So thank you.
Thanks, Bernaine. I'm going to finish the last few slides before we open it up for more Q&A and discussion. Just to leave you with the fact that there's a lot of U.S. citizen action against PFAS. I put these slides up because of the work that I'm involved with. I know there's a lot of citizen action in Europe and Spain and Sweden, all over. But what you're also seeing is pressure on in the U.S. case on states to take a PFAS class approach. The state of Washington, the state of Maine are restricting or banning them in firefighting foam in in training and in air forces. And the city of San Francisco, as of 2020, will no longer allow PFAS in any food packaging sold or bought by the city of San Francisco. You're seeing a movement to tackle PFAS as a class in an increasing public right to know regarding monitoring contamination sites, etc. The link at the bottom is the Safer States website, where you can just do a search for PFAS and see all the different policies that are coming through. You're seeing a market shift to PFAS-free. The quote at the bottom, by Interface, the world's largest producer of modular carpets, actually got out of this class of chemicals in 2010, and they're very clear that their carpet requires no coatings to perform and are now made without PFAS. The California Department of Toxic Substances Control is pushing for increased recycling of carpets, but they don't want a big PFAS mess of waste. Therefore, they are also restricting the entire class of PFAS as priority chemicals in carpets and rugs. And you're seeing a knock-on effect. Pressure from NGO groups such as the Mind the Store campaign and others is to get retailers to stop selling, for instance, carpets and rugs with PFAS. Home Depot recently made the announcement that they would stop the use of PFAS in carpets and rugs, not just in the US, but also in Canada. More market shift to PFAS-free is happening with food packaging. Good old microwavable popcorn, when that was tested, was found to have very high levels of PFAS, or in that inner lining that stops the grease from it's coming through the paper. So a lot of testing has been happening on feed contact material. Recent testing on something like 6 of 20 samples found that they all contain PFAS. And in fact, some of the, in this particular study, some of the PFAS that were found under analysis actually were unidentified PFAS. So again, we're seeing the industry move from long chain to short chain, many of which have no toxicity data or no information being disclosed to regulators. So Washington State is now banning PFAS in food packaging. Countries like Denmark have banned PFAS already in food packaging. And the good news is that for PFAS-free, keeping in mind that this aqueous film-forming foam for putting out fires involving oil and gas and other flammables are now, there's many types of PFAS free on the market. In fact, Heathrow stopped using PFAS in 2012. About 90% of all airports in Australia no longer use PFAS in their firefighting foam for these Class B fires. And surprisingly, in June, I have to say surprisingly because I just came out of the blue, Transport Canada now allow airports in Canada to use PFAS-free firefighting foam. So with that, keeping to time, we now wanted to give a lot of time for Q&A and discussion for all of you about how do we move forward, what are next steps, and I'm going to hand this over to John, Faye, and April.
Sure. So we have 3 questions in the Q&A box that I can read out, and then I'll stop the recording and allow everyone to unmute if they have additional questions to pose. That's what we were going to do. So the question, oh, I thought we had 3, we have 2. Anyway, question here is, why do you think we don't have the same level of concern, monitoring, and public reporting on PFAS contamination in Canada? Is it safe to assume that contamination levels on this side of the border are comparable?
Well, I'll speak for myself, but I know that others can jump in here. I think it's potentially because we don't manufacture PFAS, PFOA in Canada. We use these chemicals. We're a user. So maybe the fact that Parkersburg in West Virginia had such high levels, maybe it's assumed that we don't have the same concern here. I'm not sure why, because certainly when you look at landfill leachate, wastewater treatment plants, and aqueous film forming foam has been used in Canada for decades. I think there's a lot of monitoring that goes on but is not revealed. And I pose this question back to all of you. Is it a cultural thing? I really don't know. Is it because we don't have the same legal framework that we can sue? I really don't know. Your guess is as good as mine.
Bernane, with your experience on this issue in North Bay, what's your reaction to this question? What's your response to it? Why there wasn't a higher level of concern?
And Bernane, you're still
Are you on mute?
She is. Do you want to unmute yourself, Bernane?
All right, thank you. I think that there is a high level of concern, but I think that it's, for most people, it comes across as a very technical issue. And there are these media reports that say, oh, it's only 2, good news story, DND has debunked. So I also think that while the health unit did produce a report, what that report recommended was additional monitoring and study. And it's difficult, I think, for the average person to access good information. I'm very optimistic about the report that the report and fact sheet that's just been made available and this webinar being available, improving that. I think it comes across to most people as complex and technical, and they want their agencies to lead for them, and they're not.
John, can I add to that? This is Faye.
Sure. Mm-hmm.
Yes, and I think one of the reasons why we did a report that focused on the Great Lakes was this notion that there are monitoring programs and there are movements being made in a lot of these types of chemicals that's, we don't talk about within Canada. And partly, as Bev mentioned, it might have to do with our legal framework where the government, sets priorities on what chemicals are dealt with on a mostly chemical by chemical basis. But when you have a focus around the Great Lakes, for instance, what you end up getting is a more comprehensive sense of the issues that might be affecting the Great Lakes. So the PFAS issue sort of came up really quickly, actually, knowing that Canada has already made decisions on some of the chemicals, the PFAS, PFOA, which are subject to the work that's being done under the Great Lakes Water Quality Agreement. So I think that kind of binational effort helps to raise the issues from the Canadian side. So we know that there's gaps in this approach, and certainly the challenge of the legal framework is one that we have to deal with, and that's part of the reason why we wanted to initiate this dialogue on the Canadian side and see how we could further those discussions.
So John, there was a question in the question answer box that Bernane actually answered, but if it's all right, I'll read it out because I think others might have had the same question. That's okay?
Sure, yeah.
So Meg Sears had asked specifically to Bernane, was the water testing data made public, including detection limit? And the answer was that the report was made available to the Association of Residents around Trout Lake. And as far as she knows, it was not made publicly available, although DND may provide it upon request. That said, the DND contact person is not always easy to identify. And the last open question that we have in the Q&A box is, are there safer alternatives to PFAS? So I don't know if you want to answer that right away or if you'd like me to go ahead and stop the recording and let people unmute their mics and move into discussion.
Yeah. Before we do that, and I don't care in terms of when you stop recording, whatever, I also would like to, I'm John Jackson and a CELA board member and have been working with Faye and Bev on this project. But in addition, I'm a co-chair of the Toxics Free Great Lakes Network, which is the binational network. And I'd like to introduce the U.S. co-chair of it, who's Mike Murray from the National Wildlife Federation. And Mike, if you could quickly, before we get into the further discussion, refer to, first of all, one of the slides which Bev had mentioned chemicals mutual concern at the end. She didn't go into detail on that and its significance. So Mike, if you could explain the chemical mutual concern aspect of the water quality agreement and the status of that, and also could speak quickly to a report that you people have recently put out on PFAS. So Mike, are you there?
Yep, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, great. Yeah, thanks, John, everyone. Yeah, again, Mike Murray. I'm a staff scientist with the National Wildlife Federation's Great Lakes office out of Ann Arbor. And in terms of the chemicals mutual concern, basically under the water quality agreement, for folks who aren't aware, Annex 3 addresses chemicals of mutual concern. That was what was stipulated in the revised agreement of 2012. So basically the two governments, the Canadian and US government, are tasked